What would you do if you discovered that the people who raised you, who tucked you in, who sat across from you at every birthday dinner, who signed your school permission slips, had never chosen you at all? That every meal, every roof over your head, every "I love you" was nothing more than a legal obligation designed to protect their inheritance. What if you found out that the moment the paperwork expired, you would be discarded like a lease agreement that had finally run its term? This is not a story about a girl who was broken by that truth. This is a story about a girl who weaponized it. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't fall apart in the hallway the night I overheard my own mother call me temporary. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I started writing things down. Every slight. Every ignored birthday wish. Every safety pin in place of a working zipper. Every college brochure spread across the dining room table. For my brother, never for me. I documented 12 years of quiet cruelty with the discipline of a lawyer and the patience of someone who understood that justice, when properly prepared for, is not luck. It is arithmetic. My name is Maya. I was 13 when I learned I was a condition. I was 25 when I collected. Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. Before the story continues, take a second to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Here we share true-to-life revenge stories where the ignored, humiliated, and betrayed rise quietly, and make it count. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and hearing from you directly. One important note. Some elements in this story have been fictionalized for educational and storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or settings is coincidental. That being said, the message I'm sharing is meaningful, and I hope it speaks to you. Back to the story. It was a Wednesday evening in October, and I was 13 years old, padding down the hallway in my socks, heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt lived in and safe. I stopped just outside the kitchen doorway because I heard my name spoken in a voice that was not meant for me. My parents, Richard and Sandra, were seated at the kitchen table with my 16-year-old brother Derek, their voices low but urgent. Sandra spoke first, and what she said detonated like a bomb dropped into a perfectly still pond. Maya is temporary. Once the trust conditions are met, things go back to normal. Richard nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something is so obviously true it barely needs confirming. Derek, and this was the part that would live in my chest for years, Derek actually smiled. Not a smirk. A real, settling smile, like a man hearing his inheritance confirmed. My hand found the wall behind me. My legs refused to move. I waited for laughter. For the punchline. For someone to say the word just. As in, we're just kidding. Nobody did. I slid back down the hallway in total silence. Closed my bedroom door without a sound. Sat in the dark on the edge of my bed. I didn't cry. Something deep inside me had turned to stone, cold and permanent, and in its place grew something else. Something I didn't yet have a name for. But it was already taking root. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing things I had always explained away. Derek's plate at dinner was fuller. His stories at the table earned follow-up questions. Mine earned polite nods. When Derek needed new cleats, Richard drove him to 3 different sporting goods stores to find the exact right pair. When my winter coat zipper broke beyond repair, Sandra handed me a safety pin and said, "Make it work for now," and I did because I always did. I started keeping a small notebook in my sock drawer. Not a diary. I had no interest in feelings. Just a list. Dates on the left. Events on the right. I didn't fully understand why I was doing it. I just knew, in some bone-deep way, that it was important to make the invisible visible. To give the unspoken a form that could not be argued with. One night, while adding a new entry by flashlight, my hand brushed the edge of my nightstand drawer and found an old birthday card I'd forgotten. Inside, in my grandmother Eleanor's looping cursive, "For our Maya, always. You are so loved." The card was from my 8th birthday, just months before both grandparents died. I stared at it for a long time. Whatever this trust was, whatever the trust meant, it had come from them. From people who had signed their names next to the word always. Why would people who loved me create something that made me feel like a burden someone was waiting to set down? Derek turned 16, and Richard and Sandra took him on college tours across 3 states: Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta. They were gone for a long weekend, and I was left with the neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, a warm woman in her 60s who fed me chicken soup and asked questions that felt genuine and slightly too perceptive. "Why aren't you going with them, sweetheart?" I said I didn't want to. I said it easily without hesitation, because I had already learned that the cleanest lies are the ones that sound like choices. That night, I lay in Mrs. Coleman's guest bed staring at the ceiling and counted the ways I had trained myself not to want things. When my family returned, Derek's college tour brochures were spread across the dining room table like a conquering general's maps. I waited 2 days, then asked quietly if I'd get college tours too someday. Sandra set down her coffee cup and said, "We'll see how things look." The phrase landed with a particular brand of softness designed to end conversations without technically refusing anything. I wrote it in my notebook. It was the first time I recorded my mother's voice directly. Not actions, not dollar amounts, but actual words. On her way back inside after dropping me off, Mrs. Coleman paused at the front door and looked at me with an expression that was not quite pity. It was something closer to recognition. She held my hand a beat too long. Filed that away too. I was 17 when I spotted the envelope on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to both parents. The return address read, Hargrove and Klein, attorneys at law. I did not touch it. I had learned long ago that touching things leaves evidence of wanting. But I photographed the return address with my phone before I poured my cereal and sat down. That night, my parents argued behind their closed bedroom door. Words bled through the walls like water through paper. Trust, conditions, 8 more years, mandatory review. My mother's voice broke somewhere in the middle. My father's voice hardened into something cold and businesslike. I lay in the dark and listened and added everything to my mental archive. The next morning, my parents were suddenly, strangely attentive. Sandra made my favorite breakfast, cinnamon French toast, without being asked. Richard inquired about my grades with what looked, from a distance, like genuine interest. It was the most unsettling morning of my 17 years. I smiled through all of it, said thank you, ate every bite. 2 weeks later, without explanation or apology, Derek was given the larger upstairs bedroom with the window seat he had always wanted. My room was relocated to a smaller, darker space at the back of the house. No one asked if I minded. No one offered a reason. I updated my notebook that night, then sat at my school's library computer the following afternoon and searched the name Hargrove and Klein. I was done waiting for information to leak through walls and closed doors. I had been rehearsing the question for 3 weeks, in the shower, on the bus, right before sleep. I had considered the timing, the wording, the exact neutral tone that would reveal nothing of the earthquake already moving beneath my composure. One Tuesday evening, with all 4 of us at the table and the pasta going cold, I pressed my hands flat against my thighs beneath the tablecloth and asked it, "Why is Derek treated differently than me?" The table went still in the way a held breath goes still. Richard did not look up from his plate. "Things are complicated," he said. "You wouldn't understand," Sandra added, with the carefully measured kindness of someone managing a fragile situation. "You'll understand when you're older. It's just family stuff." Derek said nothing, but the small, private smile that crossed his face was one I photographed with my memory and would carry for years. He nodded. I said, "Okay." I picked up my fork and finished my pasta. That same night, alone at my school's library computer, I found Hargrove and Klein listed in public business records. They specialized exclusively in estate trusts. I found the name of the lead administrator for a particular trust filed in Crestfield County. Gerald Marsh. I wrote the name in my notebook with steady hands and underlined it 3 times. Gerald Marsh. I would not forget it. The summer before I left for college, my family attended a barbecue at Aunt Diane's house. The yard was full of extended family paper plates, and the kind of loose, warm conversation that happens when people feel they are among people who already know everything about them. Derek had been drinking. He got loud, The way people get when their sense of consequence shrinks with their inhibitions. He began talking about the family's future. His future, with the ease of a man who had never once worried about money, belonging, or what the word home truly requires of the people inside it. Then he turned across the yard and looked directly at me, and he laughed. You know what's funny? She wasn't even supposed to still be here. She's just the placeholder. The trust made them keep her. Aunt Diane dropped her barbecue tongs. My uncle froze mid-sentence. Sandra's face drained of color so completely it looked like a photograph left in the sun. Richard didn't move. I felt the entire world tilt slowly on its axis. My voice, when it came, was perfectly steady, which surprised even me. What do you mean? Derek grinned with the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. You're a condition, Maya. They had to keep you or they'd lose everything. Sandra's plate hit the concrete patio and shattered. In the silence that followed, I looked at Aunt Diane, and Aunt Diane's face was not shocked. It was guilty. She already knew. She had always known. That same night back home, my parents sat me down in the living room in the particular way of people who have been bracing for a conversation for a very long time. They spoke in the flat, measured voices of people reading from an internal document. My maternal grandparents, William and Eleanor, had established a trust before their deaths. The money was intended for both grandchildren. But a clause buried deep in the legal language required Richard and Sandra to raise me in the family home, without dissolving custody, without sending me away, without legal abandonment, until the trust's expiration date, my 25th birthday. If they violated that clause in any documented material way, they would forfeit their share entirely. So they kept me. Not out of love. Not out of devotion. Out of the cold, precise logic of financial self-preservation. The trust would expire in 8 years. Sandra wept through the explanation. Real tears or something that resembled them closely enough. Richard studied the floor as though the answers to questions no one was asking were written there. I sat perfectly still through all of it and let them lay out the dollar amounts, the legal language, the timeline. I asked no questions until they were finished. Then I asked one. Did my grandparents know you would treat me this way? The silence that followed was the loudest, most complete answer I had ever received. I nodded once and went to bed. With the truth no longer requiring management, Richard and Sandra stopped pretending. The performance they had maintained for 17 years, the performance of an ordinary family with ordinary dynamics and ordinary love, was officially retired. Richard began referring to my continued residence as an obligation period. The phrase dropped into conversation with the casual ease of someone discussing a mortgage payment. When a flu kept me bedridden for 8 days, Sandra appeared in the doorway and said, "Try not to rack up unnecessary medical bills," then closed the door behind her. Derek watched all of it with the open, uncomplicated amusement of a man who had never been on the wrong side of anything. He had a name for me now. The condition, which he used only when our parents were out of earshot, always with the satisfied tone of someone who has discovered a truth others are still pretending not to know. I did not react. I increased my hours at my part-time job at Ridgeline Market. I saved every dollar I earned with the discipline of someone building toward something. I read. I researched. Late at night, I pulled up everything publicly available about trust law in our state. One evening I discovered something that made me sit very still for a very long time. Guardian conduct clauses. Provisions within testamentary trusts that allow administrators to intervene if guardians demonstrate documented harm toward beneficiaries. I didn't fully understand the scope yet, but I created a cloud folder and labeled it research. I was accepted to Whitmore State University, 2 hours from Crestfield. Far enough to breathe air that didn't carry the weight of being managed. Close enough to satisfy the trust's residency requirements, which I had now studied thoroughly enough to understand in precise detail. I had to remain an active, documented part of the household, present for holidays, summers, school breaks, to keep the trust's housing conditions technically valid. I would comply. Compliance had always been one of my strengths. I chose my major with the deliberateness of someone selecting a tool for a specific job. Finance, with a minor in contract law. Not because I loved numbers, though I was good with them. Because I needed to understand, at a molecular level, how people use paperwork to organize and control other people's lives. And what happens when that paperwork contains provisions its subjects failed to read carefully. My first semester, I visited the university's law library and submitted requests for every publicly available resource on testamentary trusts, fiduciary duty, and beneficiary rights. I read until my eyes ached. I took notes in a new notebook, not the sock drawer kind, but a proper one with tabs and section dividers. Then, in a law review article about a notable trust redistribution case from our state, I read a name I had seen before. The lead administrator, the man who had argued for the beneficiaries' rights over the guardian's objections, was Gerald Marsh. I had to set the article down and simply breathe. My college years were a masterpiece of duality performed with the precision of a long-rehearsed stage production. To my parents and to anyone watching from the outside, I was compliant, stable, and politely present. Home for every required school break, attending every mandatory holiday dinner, sending my grades home without being asked as proof of my continued, appreciative engagement with the family that housed me. To myself, I was building an arsenal. My digital archive grew with the methodical patience of someone who understood that evidence, unlike memory, cannot be argued with. Screenshots of text messages, dated journal entries with timestamps, photographs documenting disparate living conditions and unequal expenses, records comparing every financial investment made in Derek versus everything withheld from me, going back as far as I could document. I befriended a pre-law student named Cassidy, quick-minded and generous with her knowledge, who helped me understand legal terminology, precedent structures, and the language of fiduciary duty, never quite knowing why I needed to know any of it with such particular urgency. During Thanksgiving break of my junior year, I was in the kitchen when I overheard Richard on the phone with what sounded like a financial advisor. He was asking about post-expiration plans, what would become available to investments once the arrangement concluded. He sounded relaxed. He sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for 12 years and could, at last, see the exhale approaching. I added the date, the time, and the exact phrasing to my archive. In the spring of my 24th year, a certified letter arrived at my apartment. It was formal, precise, and carried the letterhead of Hargrove and Klein. As a named beneficiary of the trust, I was required to attend a mandatory review meeting before the expiration date. I read it twice, set it down, and allowed myself exactly 1 minute of stillness before I began preparing. I drove to the downtown Crestfield office building on the appointed morning with my hands steady and my folder of notes in the passenger seat. The lobby was marble and quiet. The elevator opened onto a carpeted hallway. And then I was in a conference room across a polished table from Gerald Marsh, a man of about 60 with silver hair, a measured handshake, and eyes that seemed to be running 3 simultaneous assessments at all times. We reviewed documents together for nearly an hour. He was careful. He was precise. He gave nothing away that he did not intend to give. At the end, he closed his folder and asked me something that no one in my life had ever asked me. "Are you aware of all your rights under this trust?" Said yes. It was not entirely the truth. Not yet. As I stood to leave, Gerald extended his business card and spoke in a quiet, unhurried voice. "If you ever have concerns about how you've been treated during this period, please call me. The trust protects its beneficiaries, not just the people housing them." He held eye contact for exactly 1 beat longer than necessary. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 5 full minutes before I started the engine. That night, I spread the trust documents across my kitchen table. The copies I had secretly photographed during a home visit 2 years earlier, my phone pressed flat against the bottom of my father's filing cabinet drawer. I had read them many times. I knew their rhythms and their language. But that night I read them differently. I read them with 2 years of contract law coursework, a semester of fiduciary studies, and the specific sharpened clarity of someone who now knew exactly what she was looking for. I found it in Section 7, Paragraph C. The Guardian Conduct Clause. It stated, in language that was both careful and unambiguous, that if the appointed guardians of the named beneficiary demonstrated documented patterns of emotional harm, financial inequity, or bad faith conduct toward said beneficiary during the trust period, the trust administrator held authority to modify the final asset distribution prior to expiration. The trust did not simply require housing. It required fair treatment. My grandparents, William and Eleanor, who had died when I was 8, who signed birthday cards with the word always, had not simply loved me. They had suspected. They had worried. They had sat down with their attorney and built a legal protection into the very document that was meant to govern my life, because they knew enough about Richard and Sandra to understand that love, in that house, might need enforcing. I realized this all at once like cold water. I slept better that night than I had in 12 years. 3 weeks after the meeting, I called Gerald Marsh from my apartment at 7 in the evening, when the light was long and gold through my kitchen window. I had rehearsed this conversation. I did not accuse. I did not perform. I asked specific, carefully constructed questions about guardian responsibilities under a trust's conduct clause. What constituted documentation, what qualified as demonstrable harm, what the administrator's process looked like when evidence was presented for formal review. Gerald listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he asked whether I had examples of differential treatment I would be willing to share. I had a folder containing 847 individual items. I described them methodically and without emotional inflation. The food disparity, the medical bill comment, the safety pin code, the college tours I never received, the text message chain where my parents referred to me as a condition, the barbecue in Aunt Diane's yard where Derek announced my legal status to the extended family as though it were a funny story. I described the bedroom reassignment, the financial records I had assembled. Gerald took notes throughout. When I finished, he spoke with the calm precision of a man who had administered trusts for 30 years. At the expiration date, all guardian conduct is formally reviewed. Nothing is assumed. Everything is considered and weighed. Before I hung up, I asked, "What happens if the conduct clause is triggered?" His answer was brief. The trust reallocates. It protects its true beneficiary. I went to my window and looked out at the city for a long, quiet time. I turned 24. My parents organized a small dinner, just the 4 of us, and Sandra made a toast about finally getting through a long chapter together. Her voice carrying the warm, slightly wistful tone of someone who believed the story was almost over and had ended in their favor. I smiled and raised my glass and thanked her. Richard made a joke about converting my childhood bedroom into a home gym once things settled. Derek had begun referring to the house as ours in my presence. Not carelessly, I thought, but deliberately, as though he was already painting over me. I ate my dinner, laughed when laughter was called for, and went home feeling like a countdown clock dressed in ordinary clothes. 4 days after the dinner, Aunt Diane called me privately. She was crying, the kind of crying that had been building for a long time and finally found an exit. She said she was sorry she had never said anything sooner. That she had seen things over the years at family gatherings, the way I was spoken to, the way Derek was elevated, the 1,000 small ways a child can be told they are lesser without a single word being used. She had stayed quiet because she didn't want to cause conflict, because it wasn't her family, because she had told herself it wasn't that bad. I listened without speaking. When Diane finished, I said, "I need a written statement. Everything you witnessed. Dates if you remember them. I will tell you exactly what format to use." Aunt Diane agreed without hesitation. With 11 months remaining before my 25th birthday, I began the final stage of what I had privately called the construction. I coordinated with Gerald's office through careful, documented legal channels, submitting evidence in organized, time-stamped batches. Financial records showing the decade-long spending disparity between Derek and myself, communication logs spanning 6 years of text messages and emails, witness statements from Aunt Diane and 2 former teachers who had reported concerns about my home environment to the school guidance counselor, and audio recordings made on dates and in states where single-party consent law applied. Cassidy, my pre-law friend, spent 2 weekends helping me organize everything into a format that precisely matched what a trust administrator's office was required to receive and process. It was meticulous, detailed work, and I found something close to peace in it. The same peace I had found in my sock drawer notebook at 13, when I first understood that making the invisible visible was not just an act of survival but a form of power. Then, while combing through bank records I had requested through the estate's public filings, I found something my parents had never mentioned. The trust was worth significantly more than I had ever been led to believe. My parents had been drawing management fees from it for years, quietly, in amounts that added up to a number that made me grip the edge of my kitchen table. The total was large enough to rewrite my future entirely. I sat with that information for exactly one evening. Then I got back up and kept working. Derek, who had spent 2 years at a startup that ended badly, had moved back into the family home with the comfortable entitlement of someone who had never truly been required to reckon with failure. He had decided the house was his future. He scheduled contractor walkthroughs. He talked about knocking down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room, adding a home office where my childhood bedroom used to be, tearing up the backyard to put in landscaping that matched a reference photo he had found online. He invited his friends over on a Saturday to tour the property with the proprietary pride of someone who already owned it. One evening, sitting across from me at dinner, he tilted his head with the casual cruelty that had always been his signature and said, "You should probably start packing your sentimental stuff. Mom and Dad are going to want to redecorate pretty soon." I met his eyes. I smiled with complete sincerity. "Good idea," I said. "I've been thinking the same thing." Derek laughed, pleased with himself, and went back to his food. That same night, an email arrived from Gerald Marsh. The trust review panel had completed its preliminary assessment. The submitted evidence had been evaluated and validated. A formal decision would be finalized and ready for delivery by my birthday. He required one confirmation. Did I wish to be present at the expiration meeting? I opened a new email and typed my reply immediately. One word. 7 days before my 25th birthday, my parents began to glow with a quiet, barely contained relief that they had clearly been rationing for years. Sandra dropped hints about collecting childhood mementos, just to get a head start on organizing. Richard referred to freedom, in casual conversation with the breezy confidence of a man who believed the math had already been settled in his favor. Derek posted a photograph of the house on social media, the front porch bathed in afternoon light. His arm stretched along the railing, with the caption, "New chapter incoming." I said nothing. Packed one box. I labeled it correctly. I placed it by my old bedroom door, as though I was participating in the conclusion they had written for me. Every evening that week, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed my files one final time, not from anxiety, but from discipline. I believed in preparation the way some people believe in prayer, not as a hedge against the worst, but as a practice that makes you worthy of the outcome you're working toward. On Thursday, Mrs. Coleman called out of nowhere. She had seen Derek's social media post and recognized the house. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" When I said yes, Mrs. Coleman said she had always felt something was wrong in that house, that she should have pushed harder, asked more questions, been braver about what she had suspected. I asked her one thing. "Will you write down what you observed during the times I stayed with you? Dates, what I said, what I looked like." Mrs. Coleman said she would do it that very night. She did. My 25th birthday fell on a Saturday in late September, the kind of morning that arrives with blue skies and a cool, clean wind that suggests the world is taking a breath before something significant. I woke early. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes doing nothing but breathing. Then I got dressed with the deliberateness of someone suiting up, drove 2 hours to Crestfield, and arrived at my parents' house at noon. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. My parents had made effort. There were flowers on the table. Sandra had cooked a real dinner. Richard opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for what he called special occasions, and the phrase landed with an irony that I absorbed without expression. We ate. My parents delivered their speeches with a particular warmth of people who were celebrating an ending they believed benefited them. Sandra said I would always have a place in their hearts. Richard thanked me for being understanding about the family situation, a phrase so staggeringly revisionist it deserved a museum exhibit. Derek raised his glass and delivered a toast about new chapters, reusing the same phrase he had posted on social media, because Derek had never been original about anything in his life. I smiled through all of it. Then the doorbell rang. Richard frowned and set down his fork. "We're not expecting anyone." Sandra went to the door. Her sharp, involuntary gasp was audible from the dining room. Gerald Marsh walked in wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a leather folder. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had done this before and was entirely unafraid. Gerald settled into a chair at the dining room table without being invited to sit, as though the question of invitation did not apply to him there. He arranged his documents with the deliberate, unhurried precision of someone for whom time was no longer anyone else's advantage. Richard's face cycled through confusion, irritation, and the first edge of something that hadn't appeared there in a very long time. Genuine fear. "As you know," Gerald began, "the trust expires today. All housing conditions have technically been maintained throughout the prescribed period." Richard and Sandra visibly relaxed. Sandra actually smiled, the smile of a woman who had just heard the verdict she had prepared for. "However," Gerald continued in the same even, unhurried tone, "before final distribution is executed, I am required by the terms of the trust to conduct a full guardian conduct review." He opened the folder. He removed a single printed document and read aloud from it. It was a text message. Richard to Sandra, sent 3 years earlier. "She's just a condition we have to satisfy. 8 more years and we're done with it." Sandra's face turned the color of old paper. The word "done" sat in the air of the dining room like something that had just been named for what it actually was. Gerald did not pause. He did not look up to assess the damage. He simply continued, quote after quote, date after date, returning my parents' own words to them in his calm, unhurried voice. In their own dining room. On their daughter's birthday. Derek laughed nervously. The laugh of a man who hadn't yet understood the rules of the room he was in. He leaned forward and attempted the argument he had always reached for when I had been the topic. "She's exaggerating. She always dramatizes things. That's just how she is." Gerald turned to look at him. His expression did not shift by a single degree. "You are not a beneficiary of this trust," he said. "Your opinion is not a relevant variable in these proceedings." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. The silence of a room in which a sentence has permanently rearranged the furniture. Derek's face darkened. He was not accustomed to rooms in which he was irrelevant. Gerald turned back to my parents and continued methodically. He presented testimony from 2 of my former teachers, women who had reported concerns about differential treatment to the school guidance counselor years earlier, whose written accounts had been sitting in a file, waiting. He presented the comparative bank records. He presented Mrs. Coleman's detailed written account of the weekends I had spent at her house, the things I had said, and the way I had looked. He presented Aunt Diane's sworn statement. He presented the audio recordings. Richard stood up. His voice was sharp and controlled, the voice he used when he believed volume and certainty were interchangeable with power. "You're taking all of this completely out of context." Gerald raised one hand just slightly, just enough. "All evidence submitted was independently verified prior to this meeting." He slid a document across the table. "The Guardian Conduct Clause has been triggered. The distribution has been modified." Sandra snatched the paper before it had fully stopped moving. Her eyes scanned it. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "How much?" Gerald answered without blinking, without softening the delivery, without the courtesy of building toward it. 85% of the total trust value had been legally reassigned to me, the beneficiary for whom the trust was designed and who had experienced documented harm across the duration of its term. The remaining 15% would be transferred to Richard and Sandra as proportional compensation for housing costs, calculated in good faith. The total sum was large. Very large. Larger than my parents had ever disclosed. Derek's chair tipped and hit the floor as he rose. "That's our money. That was family money. Our family money." He was louder than he intended. louder than the room could hold. Gerald looked at him with the same expression he had worn since he walked in, the expression of a man entirely undisturbed by the weather. It was trust money with legal conditions attached. The conditions were violated. The trust protected itself accordingly. He began to pack his folder with the methodical care with which he had unpacked it. All appeals were reviewed and denied last week, prior to this meeting. The decision is legally final. The transfer will complete Monday morning. Richard threatened lawyers. His voice had the specific hollow quality of bluffing. Sandra began to beg, a word I would not have thought applicable to my mother until that moment. Derek shouted. Gerald did not respond to any of it. He stood, crossed the room, shook my hand once and left. In the silence that followed, I realized I felt none of what I had expected. No triumph, no glee. Just an enormous, unexpected quiet, like the inside of a room after a window has finally been opened. The four of us sat in the wreckage of the dinner. The flowers were still in their vase. The wine bottle was still half full. The birthday cake Sandra had made was still uncut on the kitchen counter, still wearing its candles. Richard's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse in a way I had never heard before. How could you do this to us? We are your family. I looked at him directly. You told me I was temporary for 12 years. You counted down the days until you'd be finished with me. You called me a condition to your own faces in your own kitchen and thought I was asleep. Sandra shook her head with the tired motion of someone who had been holding a different version of this story for a very long time. We gave you a home. We fed you. We clothed you. We did everything we were required to do. You did the minimum necessary to avoid losing the money, I said. That is not love. That is compliance. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and you have always known which one this was. Picked up my purse. I did not raise my voice. I had never needed to. I'm leaving now. Please don't contact me. I walked to the front door. Behind me, Sandra's tears began. Real ones this time, which was almost funny, in the particular way things are funny when they arrive 12 years too late. Richard's voice rose. Derek said something I didn't catch and would not make the effort to remember. I closed the front door behind me so quietly it barely made a sound. By Monday morning, the transfer had completed. I sat at my kitchen table in my apartment, opened my bank account on my laptop, and allowed myself exactly 30 seconds to look at the number before I closed the screen. It was enough. More than enough. I spent that first week making decisions I had been holding in storage for years, decisions I had always known I would make the moment the math allowed for it. I paid off my student loans in a single transaction and permitted myself exactly one moment of real, physical stillness to mark it, the zeroed balance on the screen, and the breath I took after seeing it. I purchased a small house in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of the city, with a backyard big enough for a garden and a kitchen with windows that faced the morning. I accepted a full-time position at a non-profit organization that provided legal advocacy for children navigating the foster care system. Children who needed someone who knew, in their body and not just in theory, what it meant to live inside a structure that treated you as a problem to be managed. The backlash from extended family arrived quickly and predictably. Some apologized. Some accused. Some demanded explanations I had no obligation to supply. I blocked Derek on every platform without reading a single message. My aunt forwarded a letter from Sandra, the envelope still sealed. I held it for a long moment, placed it in a drawer I didn't open often, and went outside to plant the first thing in my new backyard. The act of putting something into the ground felt more important than whatever was in the envelope. 6 months after my 25th birthday, I began weekly sessions with Dr. Reeves, a quiet, perceptive woman who specialized in complex family trauma and who asked questions that were not designed to comfort but to illuminate. In our third session, she offered me a framework for what had been done to me during those 12 years. Most parentified children are forced to become adults too soon, she said. You were forced to be temporary, to never fully belong, to exist under conditions. That is its own specific category of harm, the trauma of conditional existence, of being loved only as a function. Something broke loose in me when I heard those words. Not dramatically. Not the way it breaks loose in movies with tears and revelation music. Quietly. The way a thing that has been lodged in the wrong place finally settles into the right one. Over the following months, I acquired language for what had been done. Financial abuse, emotional neglect, conditional regard, systematic psychological manipulation. The words mattered more than I had expected. They gave it structure. They made it something that could be examined from the outside, rather than lived from the inside. In our 6th session, Dr. Reeves asked about guilt. Do you feel guilty about the redistribution? I considered this seriously. No, I said. They put a price tag on love. The trust simply enforced the receipt. Dr. Reeves wrote something in her notepad. That same week, I ran into Mrs. Coleman at a farmer's market. Over coffee, Mrs. Coleman said something that stopped me completely. Eleanor told me once she was worried about leaving you with your parents. I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. 5 years after my 25th birthday, I sat in the backyard of my house on a Saturday morning in the kind of September light that makes everything look deliberate. The garden I had planted the day I moved in was real now. Full and green and entirely mine, growing the way things grow when they are tended without conditions. Jordan, the man I had been with for 3 years, brought me coffee without being asked and sat beside me in the easy, unhurried silence of someone who knew my whole story and had never once flinched at any part of it. Aunt Diane visited sometimes, bringing pie and carrying the specific, careful warmth of a woman still making good on an old debt. Mrs. Coleman sent cards on birthdays. My work at the nonprofit had resulted in 3 successful custody intervention cases I was quietly, deeply proud of. I heard through Aunt Diane that my father had passed away the year before. I felt grief when I heard, not for the man he was, but for the man he had the capacity to be and never chose. Sandra's letters arrived every few months. I had opened 2 of them. I might open more someday. I might not. That choice belonged entirely to me. I thought sometimes, in the way you think of someone you once were and barely recognize, of the 13-year-old girl pressing herself flat against a hallway wall. Hearing the word temporary fall from her mother's mouth like a verdict. I wished I could reach back and tell her, you are not the word they used for you. You are not their lease. You are not their condition. You are not their deadline. I was never temporary. I was simply waiting with extraordinary patience for the right moment to prove it. And some things once proven can never be taken back. If this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel for more true stories like this one. Leave a comment below, telling me what you would have done in my situation. I read every single one. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your share might save someone's life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know this wasn't an easy story to hear, and I want to be honest with you. Some of the stories that follow contain fictionalized elements, created for educational purposes. If that's not something you're comfortable with, feel free to explore other content that suits you better. But if you're willing to learn from real experiences, even painful ones, I'll be here sharing what I've learned. God bless you. And remember, protecting what is yours is never an option.